This isn't Africa. Boy, we do real science here." Those words weren't whisper, they were spat right across the lab table, in front of a full classroom of students, and they weren't said to just anyone. They were said to Kweku Mensah, a 21-year-old Ghanaian-born student who had come to the U.S. on a full scholarship, brilliant, soft-spoken, and determined to study quantum computing. What his professor didn't know was that the boy he humiliated wasn't just smart, he was working on something that would change the field. And it would be Kweku's name, not the professor's, that the world would remember. The first time Kweku Mensah stepped into Dr. Richard Halverson's quantum research lab, he was 10 minutes early. His shirt was neatly tucked in, notebook in hand, shoes polished, and yet, from the moment he entered, he felt it. Not just the stares, the pause in conversation when he walked past, the subtle way chairs didn't scoot over to make room. How the only other black student, James, from chemistry gave him a look like, "I hope you know what you're doing." Dr. Halverson didn't look up from his laptop when Kweku introduced himself. "Mensah, that's you." "Yeah, sir." He said, as if the syllables of Kweku's name tasted strange in his mouth. He waved vaguely toward the far end of the lab, near the door. "You can sit over there. For now, let's see if you can keep up." No welcome. No handshake, just that Kweku had grown up in Accra, Ghana, where his father ran a small computer repair shop and his mother was a retired math teacher. From the age of 8, he was building logic gates out of old radios. By 13, he was modeling particle simulations on a second-hand laptop. And when he got into a Ivy League on a full scholarship, his entire neighborhood celebrated with him like he'd won the World Cup. But in this room, he was just another black boy who didn't belong. The lab was divided into teams working on thesis projects. Kweku had requested to study quantum tunneling effects in entangled particles, a subject Dr. Halverson was supposedly a leading expert in. But when assignments were handed out, Kweku was given data cleaning and historical indexing. Essentially, janitor work for code. He didn't argue, not out loud. Instead, he got to work, quiet, relentless, watching, and slowly, on his own time, started building a model of his own. A model that didn't just organize old data, it predicted behavior. It was an algorithm that could reshape the way physicists understood spin-state collapse under observational delay. But he kept it to himself, for now. Then came the incident. One afternoon, Dr. Halverson caught Kweku running a personal simulation on one of the lab's lower-tier processors, a system students often used for testing side concepts. "You're not authorized to run anything." Halverson barked. Kweku stood calmly. "I wasn't interfering with teamwork. I used the idle sandbox. You used my resources without clearance. With respect, sir. The system is open access under the Student Research Clause." Halverson cut him off. "This isn't Africa, boy," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "We don't play pretend with science here." The room froze. Kweku stood still, holding his notebook tight. He didn't say a word, didn't storm out, didn't yell. He simply picked up his bag and left. But that night, in the quiet of his dorm, he made a decision. "I won't fight him with words," he told himself. "I'll let the work speak." For the next 3 months, Kweku spent every spare minute developing his thesis in silence. No one offered to help. No one asked questions. Some even mocked him in whispers. But he kept going. Because what Dr. Halverson didn't know was that Kweku's algorithm had already caught the attention of a visiting scholar from MIT, and a draft of his paper. It was already in peer review. It was a rainy Wednesday when the email came. The subject line was short, almost underwhelming. Decision. Quantum Journal Submission, AQ 412. Kweku clicked it with trembling fingers. "Dear Mr. Mensah, we are pleased to inform you that your manuscript titled Predictive Collapse Behavior in Delayed Observation in Tangled Systems has been accepted for publication in the upcoming issue of Quantum Perspectives. Your paper was highly rated by all 3 reviewers for its originality, clarity, and potential impact in the field of quantum mechanics. He reread it 5 times. He didn't smile. Not right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and breathed, not because he needed the world to know, but because now, finally, he did. He had proof. 2 weeks later, the journal quietly released its upcoming issue preview, and there it was, page 1, lead article by Kweku Mensah, Lincoln University Quantum Computing Lab. It made ripples fast, particularly in the tight-knit community of theoretical physics where innovation is rare, and name recognition means everything. What no one outside the lab realized yet was that this paper didn't just stand out. It preempted the topic Dr. Halvorson had been chasing for the last year, and he noticed it started small. At the next lab meeting, Dr. Halvorson's tone shifted tighter, colder. He corrected Kweku for things he hadn't said, interrupted him mid-sentence, dismissed every suggestion before it finished leaving his mouth. One day, after a small presentation on data modeling, Halvorson looked him dead in the eye and said, "I'd be careful about claiming ideas that aren't yours, especially when you're still on a student visa." The room went silent. Kweku didn't flinch, because what Halvorson didn't know was that the dean of physics had already requested to meet him privately. That meeting happened 2 days later. Dean Patel sat across from Kweku, glasses perched on her nose, the latest issue of Quantum Perspectives on the desk between them. "I just finished reading it," she said. "It's brilliant. Thank you." "Ma'am, how long have you been working on it?" "Since my 2nd semester, independently." She nodded slowly. "I'm aware this topic overlaps significantly with Dr. Halvorson's current research proposal to the NSF. Kweku looked up sharply. "I didn't take anything from his team. He didn't let me near real research. Everything in that paper is mine documented, time-stamped, peer-reviewed." Dean Patel smiled slightly. "I know. That's why I'm here. Not to accuse you, but to protect you." He blinked. "I want you to present this work at the Intercollegiate Research Conference next month. Represent Lincoln as lead researcher." Kweku's hands tightened around his notebook. "But I'm still an undergrad." She leaned forward. "Not anymore." Words spread fast. By the end of the week, everyone in the lab knew about Kweku's paper and the invitation. One student, Marie, even congratulated him. "You made history, you know," she whispered. "First student from this department to get published before graduation." He nodded. But Ethan, Halvorson's favored research assistant, wasn't as impressed. "You really think they'd have published it if you weren't a diversity story?" He scoffed. Kweku didn't answer. He just raised an eyebrow, then walked away, because he had bigger things to focus on. The next day, Halvorson finally snapped. He called Kweku into his office, cold, dark, the blinds half drawn like a courtroom. "I read your paper," he said. Kweku sat silently. "You're aware it mirrors elements of my proposal to the NSF. I developed my algorithm before I even knew your proposal existed." Halvorson leaned back. "Are you accusing me of stealing your work?" Kweku tilted his head. "I'm saying I didn't need yours." A long pause. Then Halvorson said something soft, quiet, but laced with venom. "You'll find this country doesn't reward boys who get too bold. Not for long." Kweku stood. "Maybe not. But it does reward results." And then he left, not angry, not shaken, just done playing small. That night, as rain tapped gently against his dorm window, Kweku opened a fresh notebook. Not for equations, but for his speech, because in 30 days, he'd take the stage at one of the most respected scientific conferences in the country, and speak not as the African boy in the back of the lab, but as the man who just outpublished the professor who told him he didn't belong. The grand Hyatt Conference Center buzzed with a kind of energy only the top 1% of academic minds recognized. Over 500 researchers, professors, and graduate prodigies from all over the country had gathered for the annual Intercollegiate Research Conference, but nobody expected a 21-year-old undergrad to headline the afternoon session, let alone him. Kweku stood backstage, fingers gripping the edge of his flashcard notes, though he hadn't looked at them in hours. He was dressed in a fitted black blazer and charcoal slacks, polished shoes, collar crisp. The only thing betraying his nerves was the slight tap of his foot against the floor. "You good?" asked a voice behind him. It was Dr. Patel. She smiled. "You earned this. Let them know who really rewrote the rules." Kweku nodded slowly, not in fear, in focus, because this wasn't just about science anymore. It was about showing the world what it refused to see. Meanwhile, in the audience, Dr. Halvorsen took his seat, front row, arms folded, expression neutral. To most people, he looked calm. But to those who knew him well, the flicker of his eyes told another story. He didn't think Kweku would choke he needed him to, because if Kweku succeeded up there, his own career would feel the shadow. And in academia, shadows are hard to erase. Next speaker, the moderator announced, is Kweku Mensah of Lincoln University, presenting his published work on entangled systems under delayed observation. A few eyebrows rose, a few whispers. Lincoln, isn't he an undergrad? That name? I saw his paper trending on Arxiv. But the moment Kweku stepped on stage tall, composed, confident, the room quieted. He opened with a simple line, "I'm here today not to compete with tradition but to contribute to it." And just like that, he had them, slide by slide. He dismantled complexity and rebuilt it in clarity. He walked them through recursive functions, delayed observation paradoxes, and introduced his predictive collapse matrix, not a stumble, not a stutter. People leaned forward in their chairs. Pens stopped scribbling. Phones were silenced. Even the panel of judges sat straighter, because what they were watching was not normal. This wasn't a student doing well. This was a shift. Halvorsen clenched his jaw. Kweku had just referenced an equation almost identical to a proof Halvorsen himself had been quietly refining for over a year, and he'd done it more elegantly, with tighter notation, and a working application model. It wasn't just overlap. It was obliteration. At the end, Kweku paused, looked out at the silent room. When I was 8 years old in Ghana, I built my first logic gate using wires from a broken fan and the battery from a discarded phone. I didn't know what a quantum computer was, but I knew information could flow in ways people didn't expect. That's still true today. Not just with electrons, but with people. Some of us were never expected to make it to this room. And yet, here we are. He stepped back. Silence. Then a single clap. Then another. Then the entire auditorium stood. Standing ovation. Not out of pity. Not out of politics. But because genius had just introduced itself. Backstage. Kweku took a long breath. Dr. Patel walked up, beaming. "You didn't just present, Kweku," she said. "You declared war, and won it with grace." Meanwhile, out front, Halvorsen was already halfway to the parking lot. His name had not been mentioned once during the presentation. His proposal to NSF still pending, and the idea he thought he owned now bore a different name in journals and on stage. Kweku Mensah. That night, Kweku sat on the hotel balcony, laptop open, messages flooding in. One from MIT's quantum lab, another from a research team at Oxford. Even a polite inquiry from a major tech company asking if he'd consider industry collaboration. But one email stood out, a short one, from his father. "I watched the live stream. You made our name something the world has to pronounce now. Proud doesn't even begin." Kweku stared at the screen, and finally quietly he smiled. 3 days after the conference, Kweku returned to campus a changed man, or so he thought. Classmates who used to ignore him now asked about his algorithms. Professors who had once forgotten his name now offered research assistantships. The university's official page updated its banner to read, "Lincoln Student Leads National Quantum Breakthrough." But behind closed doors, someone was furious, and he wasn't done yet. In a windowless room 2 floors beneath the physics department, Professor Halvorsen sat with a grim-faced academic ethics officer. "I'm not here to damage the boy's future," he said, eyes calm. "But there are serious concerns about intellectual overlap." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting plagiarism." Halvorsen gave a tight smile. I'm suggesting it's worth reviewing." He pushed forward a folder copies of his NSF proposal, dated 6 months prior. Inside were draft equations, complex, partial, and eerily close to what Kweku had submitted. Too close, he claimed. By Monday, Kweku received a formal email from the University Academic Integrity Committee. "You are hereby notified that your recently published paper is under investigation due to concerns regarding academic authorship and potential overlap with faculty intellectual property." He froze, reread the email, then again. Overlap with faculty. His hands went cold. That afternoon, Dr. Patel called him into her office. She didn't look surprised. "I told you he'd try something." Kweku frowned. "But my work's time-stamped. I've got full records. Every simulation, every line of code, even handwritten notes. Dated, filed." Dr. Patel nodded. "And we'll show all of it." "But what if they believe him?" he asked. She leaned forward. "Kweku, they already saw your work. The whole scientific community did. You don't need to convince anyone of your brilliance anymore. But now, you need to fight to protect your ownership." Meanwhile, whispers began circulating across campus. "He stole Halverson's idea. I heard the professor had been developing that for a year. Can you even publish your own paper if your advisor's working on the same thing?" It didn't matter that Halverson wasn't his advisor, or that Kweku had done it all independently, because perception is its own form of poison. For the first time in weeks, Kweku felt invisible again, but not for long. 2 days later, something unexpected happened. The editorial board of Quantum Perspectives released a statement. "After thorough review, we reaffirm the originality of Kweku Mensah's paper. All submitted documentation predates any overlapping faculty proposals. The work stands on its own and deserves its place." The letter went viral. Retweets, reposts, forums lit up. And then came the response from the broader community. A physics professor at Stanford wrote, "You don't accuse genius of theft just because it beat you to the finish line." A viral TikTok from a grad student summed it up best. "This is what happens when the system can't handle the brilliance it didn't birth." That evening, Kweku received a message request on LinkedIn from someone he didn't expect. James, the only other black student who had once warned him to be careful. "You're making it easier for the rest of us to walk through the door. Thank you." And then another, from Marie, the lab assistant who'd once stayed quiet. "I knew you were right. I was scared to speak, but if you ever build a lab of your own, I'd like to be part of it." The final blow came 1 week later. The NSF, the very agency Halverson had applied to, sent an email to the university confirming they had rejected his funding request. Reason: significant theoretical overlap with a recently published work by another scholar. That other scholar was Kweku. Halverson's face went pale when the notice arrived. He slammed his office door and didn't return to the lab for days. He knew now he hadn't just lost control of the research. He'd lost control of the narrative. But Kweku didn't celebrate. He simply walked to the chalkboard in the empty classroom where he first took Intro to Quantum Mechanics, and started drawing again, because this wasn't the end of his journey. It was only proof he was finally free to begin it on his own terms. The emails came in waves. MIT. "We'd love to offer you a fully funded position in our Quantum Systems Initiative. Oxford. We're prepared to fast-track your graduate admission. Even create a lab around your thesis. Google Quantum A Lab. We are extremely interested in a research collaboration. Let's discuss relocation support." Each message was a dream in itself. Together, they formed a storm. But Kweku didn't reply. Not yet, because something inside him felt unfinished. He sat alone one evening in the campus greenhouse, a place few students knew existed. His fingers drifted over the pages of his notebook, not writing equations, just flipping them, feeling them. He had won, yes, but something felt hollow. Every offer, every headline, every victory. It was about the paper, about how he'd beaten the professor, how he'd proven America wrong. But what about why he'd started in the first place? He called his mother. "Ma," he said softly, "can I come home for a while?" There was a pause. Then, "Your room is still yours." "My son, the plants miss you." 3 weeks later, he stepped off the plane into the warm, dusty air of Kotoka International Airport in Accra, Ghana. It smelled like memory, like fried plantains and red earth, like childhood at home. His father had the same transistor radio playing jazz in the corner. His mother still kept her whiteboard by the kitchen, the one where she used to teach him long division while cooking. "You came back with bigger words in your mouth," she said, hugging him. "But your eyes are still the same." The next morning, he walked down to the junkyard near his old neighborhood, the place where he'd first found scraps to build circuits. It was mostly abandoned now. A few kids played with slingshots behind a pile of broken microwaves. One of them stared at him. "You're the guy from the computer video," the kid said. "You beat the American professor." Kweku smiled. "I didn't beat anyone," he said. "I just solved a problem." Later that week, he visited his old school. Nothing had changed. Wooden desks, cracked chalkboard, a busted fan still spinning halfway on the ceiling. But the teacher, Mr. Boateng, pulled him aside. "I kept your prize ribbon from Form 2, he said. "The other kids thought I was crazy, but I said, 'This one, he'll go far.'" They sat down together after class, talked about equations, politics, dreams. Then Mr. Boateng asked, "And now, after all that, what's next?" Kweku looked at the dusty windowsill. "I don't want to just chase prestige," he said quietly. "I want to build things that last. Not papers, not awards. Access." That night, under the stars, Kweku took out a fresh page in his journal. He didn't write formulas. He wrote a vision, a remote learning platform, built for low-bandwidth areas, focused on STEM education, open-source simulations, mobile-accessible tools, local mentoring from African scientists and engineers. He called it Project Logic Gate, because every child deserved a gateway to knowledge, not just the ones lucky enough to leave. 1 week later, he returned to the U.S.A. He declined Google, postponed MIT, accepted Oxford, but on his own terms. Part-time researcher, part-time director of Project Logic Gate. They tried to convince him to choose one path, but he had already chosen his own. At graduation, Lincoln University gave him the podium. The same professor who once told him this isn't Africa wasn't in attendance, but Kweku didn't mention him. Not once. Instead, he looked out at the next generation of students, many of whom looked like him, and said, "You don't have to leave your roots behind to rise. You just have to remember where you started, and who's waiting at the finish line." Just when the dust had finally settled, just when Kweku had started building something bigger than himself, the past came knocking again. Only this time, it didn't whisper. It published in the November issue of the Journal of Quantum Applications. A peer-reviewed paper appeared under the title, "Critical Re-examination of Recent Claims in Predictive Entanglement Modeling." Dr. Richard Halverson, Lincoln University. It didn't mention Kweku by name, but anyone in the field could read between the lines. The author challenges the validity and originality of recent popularized approaches in delayed collapse quantum modeling, especially those built on insufficiently verified logic paths. These oversimplifications, while popular among non-specialist circles, may mislead less rigorous interpretations of entangled states. It was a strike, coded, strategic, academic and tone-venomous in intent, and worst of all, published. Kweku saw it late one night after a colleague messaged him. "Hey, you seen this? I think it's aimed at you." He read it once, twice. His stomach twisted. He didn't panic, but he felt it, the old fear, the one that says, they're going to believe him. Again, the next morning, his inbox was already filling up. Some congratulated him for being referenced at all, a backhanded compliment. Others asked if he planned to respond. One email simply read, "You okay?" It was from Marie. She had left Halverson's lab 2 weeks after the ethics probe. He replied, still standing, but tired. 2 days later, Dr. Patel called. "I read it," she said. "It's as subtle as a slap." Kweku stayed quiet. "You don't need to respond. You've already proven your work." "I know." But silence lets him write the next paragraph. She exhaled, then let's write our own. But before Kweku could draft a rebuttal, the community moved faster than he did. A professor from Stanford posted a full article titled, Academic Gaslighting, When Power Attacks Genius. It trended on X, formerly Twitter. A renowned physicist from Switzerland wrote, Mensa's work stands independently. The critique reads less like science and more like resentment. Even MIT's Quantum Lab issued a statement. We reaffirm the validity of Kweku Mensa's published findings and consider his predictive model a key contribution to the field. Attacks grounded in professional ego, not data, damage science. Then came the letter, an open statement signed by over 70 scientists, PhDs, and engineers including Nobel Prize nominees. It was titled, We Stand with Mensa. For too long, voices from the Global South, particularly Black scholars, have been expected to prove their legitimacy twice as hard and apologize for it afterward. We will not allow the narrative to be rewritten out of envy or ego. Mensa earned his place and we defend it. It went viral in 24 hours. News outlets picked it up. Quantum War at Lincoln University. CNN headline. When the student becomes the threat. Vice. How a Ghanaian prodigy flipped the science world upside down. BBC. Halverson stayed quiet, but the university didn't. A formal academic board reviewed his article and found it ethically dubious and rooted in personal grievance. Halverson was placed on academic suspension. It wasn't just about plagiarism anymore. It was about integrity, tone, power, and who had abused it. But Kweku, he didn't celebrate. He didn't write a scathing rebuttal, didn't post a viral takedown. He wrote a thank you letter to every person who had stood up when he couldn't, to those who saw value in truth before they saw it in reputation. Then, quietly, he released a short video online, a whiteboard. Him, standing alone, writing a single phrase. Let the work speak. It always will. And in that moment, calm, direct, quiet. He said more than any journal could. The invitation arrived not as an email, but as a hand-delivered envelope bearing a red wax seal and the words, World Summit on Innovation and Equity, Geneva, Switzerland. Inside was a letter. We are gathering global voices to speak not only on the future of science, but the future of access, ethics, and education. We would be honored to have you address our plenary session as a keynote speaker, not just for your work, but for what it stands for. SET, the Council on Global Inclusion and Innovation, UNESCO. Kweku reread it twice, then looked out the window of his apartment in London, walls still bare. Suitcase still half-packed from his last campus visit to Oxford. He thought about how far he'd come, and how far he wanted others to go. Geneva was cold, but the energy was electric. Hundreds of world leaders, scientists, educators, and changemakers from over 90 countries packed into a sleek, glass-walled convention hall overlooking Lake Geneva. On the digital program, sandwiched between Nobel laureates and tech CEOs, was a name still unfamiliar to many, Kweku Mensa, Ghana. UK researcher, quantum computing and educational access advocate. No title, no doctorate yet, just a name. But by now, the world was beginning to learn it. Backstage, Kweku waited in a simple charcoal suit, hands lightly folded. One staffer whispered, "You sure you're not nervous?" He smiled. "I used to solve equations in a classroom with no fan and a chalkboard cracked down the middle. This is just air conditioning and better lighting." When they called him to the stage, the applause was polite, measured, curious. But 5 minutes into his talk, that changed. Because Kweku didn't open with science. He opened with a story. "My name is Kweku Mensa. I was born in a country where most people couldn't name a single scientist who looked like me. And I came to a country where people didn't think someone who looked like me could be a scientist at all." The crowd leaned in. He told them about the lab, about the silence, the jokes, the look in his professor's eyes that said, "You're not built for this." "But the universe doesn't care about bias," he said. "Electrons don't discriminate. Algorithms don't ask for passports. Math doesn't check accents. That got a laugh and then a pause. Then he shifted. He spoke about access, how Project Logic Gate, his learning initiative, had launched in 5 African countries, offering over 10,000 students hands-on STEM experiences through mobile devices and solar-powered classrooms. He shared a video, a girl in a village in Togo solving a quantum logic puzzle on a tablet under a mango tree, a boy in a refugee camp in South Sudan building his first circuit. We used to wait for someone else to open the door. Now, we're building our own buildings. The audience stood before he even finished. After the talk, the summit moderator stepped on stage. "You didn't just give a keynote," she said. "You gave a compass." That night, Kweku walked the empty halls of the convention center long after the cameras had stopped flashing. He didn't crave the applause. He'd already had silence long enough to value something deeper: resonance. The next morning, his inbox was flooded again. A tech firm in Singapore wanted to fund Logic Gate. UNESCO invited him to co-chair a global task force on STEM equity. A private message from a student in Brazil simply said, "I didn't think people like us could do this. You made me believe. I start my engineering degree next month." Later that week, The Guardian ran a headline: "The voice science didn't see coming and now can't look away from." But Kweku kept his head down, not in shame, in purpose, because he knew now the fight wasn't over. There were still classrooms like the one he grew up in waiting. There were still boys being told, "This isn't your place." Still girls being handed calculators like they were foreign objects. And there were still professors, still gatekeepers, who needed reminding that the future doesn't ask permission. 2 years had passed since the day Kweku stood on that global stage in Geneva, since his paper changed the trajectory of modern quantum modeling, since the university that once doubted him had quietly added his name to their wall of honor. But now he wasn't in a lecture hall, or a conference room, or on a stage with microphones. He was home, back in Accra, Ghana. The car pulled up in front of a small, familiar school painted in faded blue and white. The gates creaked. Children's laughter echoed from inside. Say, Augustine Primary and Junior High School, where it all began, where chalk dust clung to the walls, where wires from a broken radio became a circuit in his hands, where his teacher once gave him a 10-10 and said, "One day, you'll teach us." Today was that day. He entered the classroom slowly. Wooden benches. 2 ceiling fans, only one spinning. The same smell of dust and mango trees from years past. The students rose to greet him, their voices bright, curious. "Good morning, Mr. Kweku." He smiled. "Just Kweku is fine. I sat where you sit now. Same uniforms, same dreams." The students giggled. He walked to the board, wrote his name, then turned. "I came here not to teach you quantum mechanics today," he said, "but to remind you of something more powerful." He paused. "You don't have to wait to be seen to begin shining." He told them stories, not of equations but of the journey, the professor who doubted him, the paper they tried to discredit, the silence he learned to turn into focus. "And then," he asked, "any questions?" Hands shot up. Some asked about computers. Some asked if he met anyone famous. One girl asked if he believed aliens were real. But then, a quiet boy in the back, maybe 9 or 10, raised his hand. "Barely." Kweku pointed to him. The boy stood slowly, voice soft. "Did it hurt?" Kweku blinked. "Did what hurt?" "When they said you didn't belong." Silence fell. Kweku's throat tightened. He walked toward the boy, knelt down beside him, and said gently, "Yeah, it hurt, but I learned something important. The ones who say you don't belong usually can't imagine where you're going. That's why you have to go anyway." That moment lingered, and when he stood again, the room had shifted, not just because of the words, but because of who said them. A boy who once sat in the same chairs, who now rewrote the rules and returned not to gloat, but to guide. After the session, one teacher approached him near the exit. "We still have your old report cards," she said proudly. He smiled, "Even the ones with bad handwriting." She laughed, "Especially those." She hesitated, then added, "We tell your story often." but it means more when you come back and tell it yourself." He nodded. "Stories don't become real until someone sees themselves in them." Later that day, Kweku stood outside the school, watching the children run down the hill toward the mango grove, the same way he once did. Books in hand, head full of stars. He reached into his backpack, pulled out a small box, opened it. Inside, a worn-out, rusty fan motor. The first one he ever used to build logic gates. He placed it on the steps beside the door. No label, no plaque, just legacy. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the dusty streets of Accra, Kweku wrote the final line in his journal. They said, "This isn't Africa, boy, but I say, this is exactly where the future begins." And with that, he closed the book, because the question was never whether he belonged. The question was always, what doors would he open next for those coming behind him?